The true measure of aerial warfare in the Second World War was not found in the initial daring blitzes or the tight tactical duels of 1940 and 1941. It was realized, grimly and decisively, in the moments when the strategic balance tipped, violently and irrevocably, subjecting the pilots of the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, to a new, terrifying reality. They transitioned from the hunters in a sky they had dominated, or at least fiercely contested, to the desperate quarry, overwhelmed by a quantity of material, a quality of technology, and a sheer force of will that dwarfed their rapidly dwindling capabilities. The air became a space defined not by heroism, but by geometry, logistics, and physics stacked mercilessly against them. This was the era when American industrial capacity, fueled by an inexhaustible stream of resources, translated directly into an aerial power so vast that it crushed the will of its adversaries, often before the actual engagement began. It was the age of overwhelming air superiority. The precipice of this collapse, the moment when the German and Italian air forces first understood the scale of the commitment arrayed against them, occurred in the blistering heat of the Mediterranean skies during the summer of 1943. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, demanded comprehensive air cover. But beyond the immediate beachheads, the great strategic asset the Allies brought to bear was range, and with it, safety for the massive bombardment formations. The first moment of realization played out high above the arid, sun-scorched earth of Sicily. Prior to this campaign, German fighter pilots, many flying the ubiquitous battle-scarred Messerschmitt Bf-109G, or the heavier, sand-worn Junkers Ju-88s used for reconnaissance and occasional bomber interception, had established a predictable operational routine. The great American formations of Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, blinding silver shapes high in the pale blue, were vulnerable. Their escort, typically Spitfires or P-40 Warhawks, had a limited operational radius. Once the bombers pushed beyond that geographical choke point, the Luftwaffe was free to execute its methodical, damaging attacks, often approaching from out of the sun, capitalizing on the 10-minute window of vulnerability before the bombers reached their target or turned for home. On this particular day, the familiar rumble of the four-engined bombers materialized as expected, a sound that carried across the vast expanse of the sea and high into the atmosphere. The German interceptors climbed, their engines protesting in the thin air, the cockpit canopies often chipped and hazed by sand particles kicked up from the forward desert airstrips. They saw the dazzling formation, the silver flying box, and positioned themselves for the high-side attack. The crews prepared for the usual dance, a quick, concentrated pass, followed by a swift dive back toward the safety of altitude, evading the lethal crossing streams of .50 caliber fire the fortresses spat out. But as they closed the distance, scanning the sunline for the telltale shapes of the escort, something new, something deeply unsettling, appeared. There, maintaining perfect station with the B-17s, were silhouettes unlike anything they had routinely faced in this theater. They were twin-boomed, centrally podded, angular machines whose distinctive profile made them look like colossal predatory insects suspended against the azure sky. These were the Lockheed P-38 Lightnings. The Germans had known of the type, nicknamed the fork-tailed devil, but here they were deployed not just in small numbers, but as a deep, cohesive screen, possessing the necessary range to travel with the bombers to their operational apex and back. The P-38s, with their powerful twin Allison engines and formidable forward-firing cannon armament clustered in the nose, were fast, capable at altitude, and, crucially, they carried external drop tanks, a tactical innovation that radically redefined the geometry of air war. The aerial tide turned instantly into a merciless pursuit. The German pilots, trained to exploit the logistical limitations of their enemy, suddenly found those limitations erased. The expected 10-minute window stretched into an indefinite period of peril. Attempting to penetrate the formation meant not just facing the dense, coordinated fire of the B-17 gunners, but running a gauntlet of dedicated, long-range escorts whose pilots were fresh, fueled, and itching for a fight. In the ensuing engagement, the dynamic shifted from intercept to desperate evasion. The Lightnings, using their speed advantage and capacity for rapid dives, broke German formations before they could organize their attack patterns. The German objective instantly pivoted from shooting down bombers to merely surviving the encounter with the escorts. Pilots who had grown accustomed to controlling the terms of engagement over the Mediterranean now found themselves in a terrifying asymmetrical hunt, signaling the end of uncontested air superiority in the theater.
The sheer volume of incoming American aircraft and the sudden technological shock of the P-38's deep reach was the first cold slap of reality. The war in the air would now be fought on Allied terms, dictated by their industrial output and logistical mastery. The battle over Sicily was merely a proving ground. The true test and the true horror awaited over the heart of the Reich itself.
We ascend now to the freezing, thin-aired altitudes above industrial Germany in 1944, the domain of the high sky, a cold, painful world where every breath felt inadequate and every control surface struggled against the extreme elements. This environment, where temperatures routinely dropped far below zero, formed the backdrop for the second, and arguably most devastating, revelation of Allied air power, the advent of the true long-range fighter and the concept of the impregnable bomber fortress. The German air defenses, though sophisticated and multi-layered, relying on complex ground-controlled interception (GCI) networks and formidable flak batteries, were designed to concentrate their dwindling fighter resources in focused attacks against the bomber streams. Pilots flying the latest iterations of the May 109 and the formidable Focke-Wulf FW-190, often fueled with high-quality but scarce fuel, were tasked with punching holes in the bomber formations, ideally employing high-energy attacks that minimized exposure to the defensive fire. On a typical high-priority raid deep inside German territory, targeting synthetic fuel plants or aircraft factories hundreds of miles past the Rhine, the Axis pilots faced a scene of industrial menace unparalleled in military history. The sky was dominated by the visual presence of hundreds of four-engined American heavy bombers, forming what the pilots called the fortress box. This intricate, mutually supporting arrangement of flying fortresses or liberators was a lethal geometry of interlocking arcs of fire. The sheer metallic mass of this formation, vibrating the cold air with the synchronized roar of thousands of horsepower, acted as a moving aerial city that shrugged off the effects of isolated attacks. The German pilots climbed, their cockpit canopies sometimes frosted with rime ice that had to be physically scraped away before final approach. The air was painfully thin, demanding meticulous management of engines that were stressed to their limits. They had learned, through bitter experience, that approaching this formation meant flying into a storm of heavy-caliber ammunition, a solid wall of copper and steel. They could endure the defensive fire. They could manage the GCI instructions. But what consistently broke their resolve was the silent, sudden appearance of the long-range escort. This moment was defined by the arrival of the North American P-51 Mustang. The Mustang was a synthesis of elegant design and strategic genius, combining the sleek, laminar flow wing profile with the power of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, later built under license by Packard. It possessed a fuel capacity, particularly with the addition of external drop tanks, that granted it a seemingly impossible range. Unlike previous escorts that had to turn back at the halfway point, the Mustangs were capable of riding the bomber formations to the target and back, acting not as temporary guardians, but as relentless executioners. The sight of the Mustangs was cinematic, terrifying, and final. They often approached, unheralded, from above or behind the German interception stream. Their long, slender noses and perfect aerodynamic lines contrasted sharply with the boxy, rugged German fighters. They were faster at altitude, more maneuverable than the German interceptors at speed, and piloted by Americans who now held the distinct advantage of surprise, altitude, and position. When the Mustangs arrived, the high sky was instantly transformed into an apocalyptic spectacle. The pristine blue turned chaotic with swirling trails of white condensation. These were the vapor trails left by aircraft pulling high-G maneuvers, the evidence of extreme energy and lethal agility. German pilots who committed to an attack on the bomber stream suddenly found themselves bracketed by these fast, silent predators. The Mustangs did not need to fight long, drawn-out dogfights. They merely needed to dive, use their superior speed to gain a firing solution, and unleash their 650 caliber machine guns, often shredding the aluminum skins of the German aircraft in mere seconds. The destruction was systemic and visible. Against the stark canvas of the altitude, spinning, flaming wreckage became commonplace. A Messerschmitt, hit squarely in the wing root by the heavy .5 caliber slugs, would abruptly shed vital structure. And Focke-Wulf, attempting a tight turn, would stall out and begin its terminal descent, leaving a black spiral of smoke that marked its funeral pyre against the white vapor trails. The impact was not just physical, it was deeply psychological. The presence of the Mustang meant that the German pilots, already strained by fuel shortages and exhausting scramble procedures, faced guaranteed combat against fresh, capable adversaries from the moment they took off until they landed. It introduced the grinding, inescapable reality of total air dominance. To successfully engage the bombers, one first had to win a decisive engagement against an overwhelming number of superior escorts. Since the Luftwaffe lacked the numbers to defeat the escorts, the bomber stream became, as intended, functionally impregnable. This single logistical achievement, the ability to provide deep, sustained escort, broke the backbone of the German daylight air defense and opened the entire Reich to continuous, devastating precision bombardment, making the skies above Germany a zone of guaranteed mortality for Axis airmen. Transitioning from the cold skies of Europe to the humid, deep emerald expanse of the Central Pacific, we encounter the third defining moment of overwhelming air power, the catastrophe known to history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944. Here, the challenge facing the Japanese Imperial Navy's Air Service, IJANS, pilots was not just advanced escort technology, but the brutal, crushing volume of American carrier-borne aviation and a terrifying asymmetry in pilot training and equipment. By mid-1944, the American fleet, Task Force 58, represented the zenith of naval striking power. The sheer number of carriers, both fleet and light, provided a continuous revolving deckload of aircraft, ensuring that any loss could be instantly replaced. The U.S. Navy pilots, hardened by months of operational experience, were flying purpose-built naval fighters, the Grumman F-66 Hellcat and the Vought F-4U Corsair. These were rugged, powerfully engined machines, designed to absorb punishment, carry heavy armament, and outpace the opposition. The Japanese pilots, however, were predominantly flying the Mitsubishi A6M0. While iconic and highly maneuverable, the Zero was dangerously outdated. It lacked armor protection for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks, making it fragile and highly combustible. Crucially, the IJNAS had suffered catastrophic attrition since Midway and Guadalcanal, resulting in a system that pushed poorly trained, raw pilots into combat far too quickly. Their ability to maintain coordinated formations and execute complex tactics was severely compromised. The defining characteristic of the battle was the sheer, organized swarm of U.S. Navy aircraft ascending to meet the incoming Japanese waves. Admiral Ozawa's attack force, comprising hundreds of Zeros, Judys, and Kates, launched in successive waves from his carriers, was a massive commitment designed to overwhelm the American defenses. But the moment these Japanese formations appeared on American radar screens, which the U.S. possessed in abundance and proficiency, a strategic advantage the Japanese often lacked, the game was over. The Hellcats and Corsairs were vectored out, climbing effortlessly to gain the crucial altitude advantage. What followed was not a dogfight in the classical sense, but an industrial-scale annihilation. Japanese formations, often without operational radios due to poor maintenance or lack of pilot training, were disorganized. They flew into an aerial ambush orchestrated by sophisticated radar control. The air above the deep emerald waters became instantly saturated with aircraft, but the balance was profoundly skewed. The Hellcat, heavier, faster in a dive, and armored, could endure dozens of hits that would instantly turn a Zero into a blazing wreck. The sensory experience for the Japanese pilot was one of terrifying asymmetry. They would see, approaching through the haze, massive, organized flights of American fighters, seemingly endless in their supply.
The individual Zero pilot, already aware of the design deficiencies of his aircraft, was suddenly engulfed. A single short burst of 6.50 caliber guns from a Hellcat could tear the wing off a Zero.
The sky filled with the metallic scent of aviation fuel, mixed with the acrid smell of high explosives and burning oil. Furthermore, the U.S. ships below provided a new, invisible layer of defense: anti-aircraft fire, enhanced by the newly deployed VT proximity fuse. This technology meant that shells did not require a direct hit. They detonated automatically when they sensed proximity to a target, creating an ever-present lethal cloud of shrapnel through which the Japanese attack planes had to fly.
The result was carnage. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft, many of which were simply unable to penetrate the thick wall of American fighters, were decimated in minutes.
Pilots stared out, hopelessly, at the sheer, crushing volume of incoming Hellcats and Corsairs, realizing their tactical training was irrelevant against such overwhelming numerical and technological superiority.
The debris from the shattered planes plunged into the deep water, marking the death of an entire generation of naval air groups. By the end of the day, over 300 Japanese aircraft had been shot down, while the U.S. suffered relatively minimal losses, earning the engagement its grim moniker. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot confirmed that the logistical capacity of the United States had transcended traditional strategic thinking. It demonstrated that air superiority could be achieved not just through tactical skill, but through sheer, continuous, and unassailable presence. The fourth moment of overwhelming U.S. air power shifts the focus from deep escort or carrier supremacy to the furnace of a dedicated, maximum-effort defense of a vital target, where the very environment was hostile and the attack methodology was suicidal. This occurred during the crucial raids on the vast oil infrastructure at Ploiești, Romania, a resource critical to sustaining the German war machine. The atmosphere surrounding Ploiești, especially during repeated, massive air attacks, was uniquely suffocating. The defense was paramount, utilizing every available German, Romanian, and contracted anti-aircraft unit. The target area was protected by rings of heavy and light flak, smoke generators, and dozens of interceptor squadrons. When a wave of bombers, such as the massive, low-level assault of Operation Tidal Wave, utilizing consolidated B-24 Liberators, approached, the sky was instantly transformed into a dynamic, chemical, and physical hellscape. Dominating the view for miles was the oily, noxious black plume rising from the burning refineries. This miles-high column of petroleum fire and soot became a visible, terrifying monument to the strategic importance of the target and a constant hazard to the pilots flying in its shadow. The German and Romanian pilots tasked with the defense, flying Bf-109s and FW-190s, often cobbled together from multiple sources, faced a dual, often contradictory challenge. First, they had to penetrate a blistering, relentless wall of friendly flak bursts. The anti-aircraft fire was so dense and so coordinated that it created a genuine metallic barrier in the sky.
pilots were forced to weave frantically through the trajectories of their own defensive shells, which detonated with deafening, sharp cracks, filling the air with jagged shrapnel. Navigating this barrage required extreme precision and nerve, knowing that a slight deviation could lead to being shattered by an 88mm round intended for an American liberator.
Second, upon reaching the bomber waves, often flying just above treetop level to avoid high-altitude flak, the Axis pilots encountered the true horror of American defensive firepower.
The B-24 Liberator, despite its rugged, slab-sided appearance, was bristling with defensive armament. Flying low, they provided excellent, unobstructed fields of fire for their gunners. When hundreds of these bombers flew in formation, their combined 50 caliber fire created a dense, solid, concentrated cone of destruction directly ahead of and to the sides of the formation, the literal wall of defensive fire. Attempting an intercept was, by its nature, a near-suicidal proposition. A German pilot, having survived the friendly flak, had mere seconds to position his aircraft, achieve a firing solution, and unload his cannon armament, all while flying straight into the converging streams of tracers that looked like ropes of incandescent light. The sensory details were overwhelming. The heat, even at a distance, was palpable, mixed with the sharp, acidic smell of cordite and high-octane fuel.
The airframe of the interceptor vibrated violently, not just from its own engine, but from the concussion of nearby explosions, both flak and the heavy caliber impact of the defensive fire on the American aircraft.
The overwhelming air power here was not purely numerical superiority in fighters, but the collective, dense power of the bomber defense combined with the impenetrable ground-based barrier. The Axis pilots were forced to sacrifice themselves by flying through a double layer of fire, one friendly, one enemy, into a chaotic environment defined by smoke, speed, and continuous explosions. Their effectiveness was often limited by the sheer lethality of the approach vector, confirming that even when the German defense was maximally deployed, the strategic momentum of the American bomber force was often physically unstoppable, regardless of the cost in lives or aircraft. The objective of stopping the flow of oil was secondary to the grim reality that any pilot who attempted the intercept was engaging in a short, brutal lottery with death. The final, grinding reality of overwhelming air power settled over the Japanese home islands in the twilight months of the war, 1945. This was an experience characterized not by a sudden technological shock or a single decisive battle, but by the relentless, continuous, and inexorable presence of an enemy that possessed an apparently bottomless reservoir of resources. By this stage, the strategic reality for the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy Air Forces was catastrophic. They were fighting on fumes, literally. Fuel was critically scarce, often derived from pine resin instead of high-quality aviation gasoline. Their pilots were exhausted, often malnourished, and barely trained, many receiving only enough instruction for basic takeoff and landing before being pushed into combat. The aircraft themselves, even the latest designs like the sturdy Kawanishi N1K Shirenkai or the speedy Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, were hastily constructed, suffering from poor quality control, unreliable hydraulics, and often fitted with inferior equipment due to material shortages. The challenge faced by the Japanese pilots now involved staring at a horizon utterly dominated by the symbols of American industrial might. The primary threat was twofold: the waves of Boeing B-29 superfortresses conducting high-altitude strategic bombing from the Marianas, and the ceaseless strikes launched by the U.S. Navy's carrier fleets operating just offshore. When Japanese pilots scrambled from their camouflaged airstrips, often just grass or dirt fields, they ascended into a sky that was already effectively owned by the enemy. They would fly out, attempting to locate the source of the continuous aerial destruction, and often find themselves staring at the steel-gray decks of the U.S. carrier fleets. This was the ultimate expression of the American supply chain, a massive floating logistical engine.
The carriers stretched across the horizon, appearing limitless in number, each deck acting as a continuous conveyor belt of fighters and bombers.
For the Japanese pilot, who knew his squadron might only have 1 or 2 operational aircraft left, and whose reserves were exhausted, the sight was a psychological hammer blow. Rising from the incandescent orange heart of the blaze, a towering, suffocating black ocean of smoke consumes the atmosphere.
The cheap, warped canopy fails to hide the menacing silhouettes of the Hellcat, Corsair, and Bearcat rapidly closing the gap. Pushing the frail fighter to its absolute ceiling, the pilot watched the distant B-29 Armada cruise serenely above, untouchable in the thin, cold blue air. The most profound realization of overwhelming air power in this final stage was the concept of inexhaustibility. The Japanese pilots knew that for every American plane they managed to shoot down, an increasingly rare feat, 2 or 3 replacements were being launched from the carriers or rolling off production lines in California, weeks before the damaged plane had even settled into the Pacific.
The skies were no longer a space where one could achieve a tactical victory. They were a space where one simply fought until the fuel ran out or the ammunition was expended, knowing the enemy would always be there, always in greater numbers, and always with greater resources.
The 5 critical moments, the shock of the P-38 in Sicily, the inexorable reach of the P-51 over the Reich, the crushing volume of the Marianas Turkey Shoot, the suffocating gauntlet of Ploiesti, and the grinding, continuous presence over the home islands, collectively traced the systematic, industrial dismantling of Axis air power. They serve as a testament to the fact that while skill and bravery defined early combat, the final outcome of the air war was determined by the overwhelming capacity of the United States to produce, deploy, and maintain an aerial force that rendered all Axis efforts unsustainable. The Axis pilots did not merely lose a series of battles, they lost the ability to contest the sky itself, a strategic defeat that sealed their fate long before the final ground engagements concluded.